Welcome to Lecture 24, where we will go over the concepts of community ecology. Now that we've examined the various types of interactions that species can have with each other, we're now going to examine overall community structure. Ecological communities can be characterized by examining certain properties, such as species richness, relative abundance of species, and species diversity. Species richness simply refers to the number of species that are present within a community. The relative abundance looks at the proportion of individuals of each species, whereas the species diversity looks at the variety of different types of organisms that are found within the community. If you take a look at the diagram below, this is commonly assessed when looking at community structure. Which community would you consider to be more diverse? If we take a look at Community 1 and Community 2, they have the same number of species, meaning that each community has 4 different species present. We can also see that the relative abundance of these species changes between communities. The Shannon Diversity Index is a widely used index that is used to compare the diversity between two communities. This can help us answer our question on the previous slide. In general, higher diversity indices or higher H values will indicate a higher diversity in the system. The formula for the Shannon Diversity Index is found below. Note that A and B represent the species that are present, P represents the relative abundance of each species, and ln is the natural logarithm. Given our example, you can take a look at the calculations below. In Community 1, our Shannon Diversity Index is calculated to be 1.39, whereas in Community 2 we have a Shannon Diversity Index of 0.71. This allows us to conclude that Community 1 is considered to be more diverse than Community 2. However, there are many challenges that can arise in determining both the number and abundance of species. There can be inaccurate species identification. Some species can have similar morphologies that leads to misclassification, or some individuals can be cryptic, which also leads to inaccurate species identification. Coracoloum crypticum is a moss species that resembles other species within the same genus, thus it is often misclassified. In addition, some individuals within the same species can exhibit a wide range of morphologies. This occurs between these two specimens that are members of the same red algal species. Note that they look so different in morphology that they may be classified as different species. Another challenge is the inaccurate census counts. The presence of rare, hidden, cryptic, or highly mobile organisms may be more difficult to account for. As a result, they may be missed and not accounted for when examining species diversity and community structure. Due to their small size, microbes are typically difficult to sample. Thus, many ecologists will rely on molecular techniques to help determine the diversity that is present within microbial communities. Another important way that we gain information on community structure is by manipulating it. Ecologists can manipulate species diversity in both lab and experimental-based communities. Note that new regulations that have been put out typically prevent ecologists from manipulating species in the natural environment. However, there are many integral studies in ecology that did just that. However, these typically occurred in the 1950s, 1960s, and prior to that. By manipulating diversity, ecologists can examine the role that diversity has on various community properties such as productivity levels, stability, and overall community organization. In general, the more diverse a community is, the more productive it will be. It can also allow for that community to withstand and recover from various environmental stresses better than less diverse communities. More diverse communities also typically resist invasion by introduced species, and this is because most of the niche space in highly diverse systems is already occupied, leaving very little space or resources for invading species. Biomass is defined as the total mass of organisms in an area. This can be a very helpful measure in order to assess productivity for an area or for a system. Highly diverse areas can generally support a wider range of life. Thus, they typically have higher biomass levels and higher productivity rates. We can also study community structure by looking at the trophic structure. The trophic structure will depict the feeding relationships or flow of chemical energy between organisms within a system. The position an organism occupies within this structure or within this analysis is termed the trophic level. Arrows are typically used to represent the direction of energy flow between organisms. Various trophic levels can be represented within these community structures or trophic structures. These can include autotrophs or producers, herbivores and primary consumers, as well as carnivores, predators, secondary, tertiary consumers, as well as parasites. Trophic relationships are generally represented by creating food chains or food webs. In a food chain, the trophic relationships are depicted as a chain or in a linear fashion, where energy is transferred simply from autotrophs to herbivores to higher level consumers, as we can see in the terrestrial and marine food chain depicted below. Food webs, on the other hand, link many food chains together. These typically form a web-like structure demonstrating the complexity of the relationship that exists between organisms within a community. Note that both of the examples used here omit the role of decomposers. Decomposers, in general, are very important in returning nutrients into the system. Thus, they play an important role, even though they are often overlooked. When studying trophic structure, it is also important to consider, is there a limit on food chains? In general, when you move between trophic levels, there's a significant amount of energy that is lost. This is because there is inefficient energy transfer at each level. This, in essence, will impose a limit on the number of links that are present within a food chain. Approximately 10% of the energy that is consumed is converted into organic matter for the next trophic level. This means that 100 kilograms of plant material can only support 10 kilograms of herbivore biomass. This in turn can only support a maximum of 1 kilogram of carnivore biomass. This means that typically 5 to 7 links are found within a food chain after the primary producer. Take a look at the diagram below to understand this concept. We can see that between autovores and herbivores, approximately 90% of the energy is lost, whereas 10% is converted from autotrophs to herbivores. This then occurs at the herbivore to consumer trophic level transition. Note that though we state that this energy is lost, keep in mind that this energy is typically lost as heat or converted into other energy forms. In addition to the concept of having inefficient energy transfer between trophic levels, the size of an animal will also impose a limit on food chains. Predators in general tend to increase in body size as you move up the food chain. This will impose a limit on the length of the food chain, because larger organisms need to consume larger prey in order to meet their metabolic needs. Smaller food items tend to be insufficient unless they are consumed in enormous amounts. For example, smaller carnivores like coyotes can easily sustain themselves by consuming smaller prey items like rodents as well as small mammals. However, larger carnivores like wolves prefer larger prey items, and they also hunt in packs to increase their hunting efficiency. This is because larger prey items will meet their nutritional needs more efficiently. Though wolves have been known to sustain themselves on smaller prey items, the success of the pack typically involves consuming the larger prey items. Baleen whales are filter feeders, and they meet their nutritional needs by consuming extremely large amounts of smaller prey items or krill. Within examining food webs and the relationship between species, some species are known to have integral roles in the community. This means that their presence or absence would have a profound influence on the community structure that results. These species can be termed foundation species, keystone species, or ecosystem engineers. Foundation species are key species that exert their effect on the community due to their large size or high abundance levels. These are typically organisms that provide habitat or food sources. For instance, the removal of the American chestnut tree due to an introduced fungus led to the extinction of many moths and butterflies. However, not all species in the community were affected. For instance, mammal populations after the removal of the American chestnut tree was relatively unaffected. Thus, their overall effect on the community may be more pronounced for certain species. Keystone species are species that exert an effect on community structure due to their ecological role. These are typically organisms that provide control over dominant species. In intertidal communities, starfish control the mussel populations, allowing for other less competitive species to survive and increasing the overall diversity of the system. When starfish are removed, certain mussel populations dominate, leading to a complete crash of the ecosystem. Ecosystem engineers are key species that can change the physical environment. These can exert both positive and negative changes. Beavers, for instance, are useful in creating dams to help transform forest areas into wetlands by diverting the natural flow of water. Food chains are also controlled by what is termed bottom-up or top-down regulation. The abundance of organisms at each trophic level is either controlled by the availability of food in bottom-up control or by their consumption by higher trophic levels, also known as top-down control. Note the diagram to the right to understand the difference between bottom-up versus top-down control. Understanding the structure of food chains and the trophic relationships that exist are very important as ecologists try to maintain the balance within ecosystems. An example of the importance of this is Lake Visijärvi in Finland. This lake was originally very highly polluted due to sewage and waste material that was released into the lake. After pollution controls were implemented, the quality of the lake water greatly improved. However, as a result of this increase in water quality, there were repeated cyanobacterium blooms. This led to high roach populations, which is a fish that typically feeds on zooplankton. In order to restore the ecosystem balance, ecologists did a massive roach removal and added stocks of predatory perch. Since this strategy has been implemented, the lake has been free of cyanobacterial blooms and the ecosystem is maintained in a much more ecologically sound balance. When studying community structure, it is also important to consider whether or not a community is at an equilibrium point. Within the field of ecology, the previous thinking was that communities were relatively stable. Communities developed over time to approach an eventual climax community. This climax community was represented by one stable equilibrium point that the community strived to reach. In essence, the community was viewed as a superorganism that functioned as an integrated unit between all of the species involved or present within that system. This view was also supported by observing that many species were commonly found together, such as maple, oak, birch, and beech trees. However, more recent ecological thinking considers that communities are a result of chance assemblages that are found together simply due to their similarities in abiotic requirements. Thus, this means that depending on the species and their abundance present, one specific community can have multiple different climax or equilibrium states. Also note that the climax equilibrium state can also change over time as well as space. This has led to the development of two models, the equilibrium model and non-equilibrium model. In the equilibrium model of studying communities, the community is believed to remain constant with respect to the number of species and their relative abundance, thus achieving or representing the climax community. The non-equilibrium model is a more recent way of thinking. This states that the community can change with respect to the number of species and their relative abundance. When studying communities, it is also important to understand the effect of a disturbance. A disturbance is considered to be any event that leads to the addition or removal of organisms or a resource. Disturbances typically prevent communities from reaching equilibrium points. They do so by changing the abundance of species or by changing the species that are present in it, thus changing community composition. Disturbances include fires, human activity, floods, and storms. A disturbance can also vary in their frequency or how often they occur, or in their severity or level of effect. A predominant theory to evaluate the effect of disturbances involves the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This states that moderate levels of disturbance may lead to higher levels of species diversity than high or low levels. This is because at low levels of disturbance, the diversity of the system is typically reduced. This will allow for the more competitive species to dominate. At high levels of disturbance, this can reduce diversity so much as the stress exceeds the tolerance level for many organisms. With an intermediate level of disturbance, however, this can increase the diversity of the system. This is through opening up habitats for less competitive species to occupy. In New Zealand streams, for instance, moderate levels of flooding, which is considered to be a disturbance, led to the highest levels of invertebrate diversity. Extreme disturbances, when they occur within an area, may lead to ecological succession. This occurs when the disturbed area is recolonized by other species. This will then lead to the sequential replacement of species over time as a community develops. Primary succession refers to the process of recolonizing lifeless regions, whereas secondary succession refers to the colonization of areas that were previously occupied. The timing and pattern of succession can vary over time and space. Also note that the interactions between species during succession can also change. Some species can act to facilitate the arrival of other species by making the environment more favorable, while others may inhibit the arrival or establishment of other species. In addition, some species may tolerate each other or have no effect on other species. The combination of positive, negative, and neutral interactions play an integral role in determining the pattern of succession, the types of species that occur, and the overall time taken to establish a community. A common example used to explain the process of ecological succession is looking at what occurs and how the community structures itself or assembles itself after the glaciers retreat in specific areas. This gives a unique opportunity to see how the community develops. Ecological succession during glacial retreat is commonly broken down into 4 to 5 stages. During the early stage, the pioneer stage, this stage is dominated by ground-dwelling plants such as liverworts, mosses, fireweed, willows, and shrubs. These pioneer plants are integral in allowing for the rest of the successional patterns to occur. This is because they typically change the environment and make nitrogen more available for different species. The primary successional species of shrub, Dryas, will dominate the community in the Dryas stage. This typically occurs about 30 years post-exposure or post-glacial retreat. This is then followed by a secondary successor or alder species of trees. This is then followed by spruce and eventually hemlock. During the later stages of succession, spruce-hemlock forests will dominate. Sphagnum moss will also dominate in the poorly drained areas. This will eventually lead to the formation of bogs as the soil becomes acidified and water is held. As the successional pattern of the community proceeds, many species will act to change the environment, such as soil pH and nutrient availability. This may facilitate or limit the colonization of specific later successional species. During the initial stages of succession, as seen in the pioneer and Dryas stage, nitrogen levels are considered to be extremely low. This subjects the initial pioneer species to very poor nitrogen supplies. As the soil properties alter due to the presence of these pioneer species, more nitrogen becomes available. This will then lead to the dominance of drier and eventually alder species. These species are known to fix atmospheric nitrogen. Thus, they can overcome this nitrogen limitation that is present in the soil. This allows for later successional species such as spruce and hemlock to then become available. Large-scale biogeographical features can also alter the diversity in communities. These include factors such as latitudinal gradients, area effects, and island equilibrium. Latitudinal gradients occur as the tropics are considered to be more diverse. This is due to their evolutionary history as well as their climate. In general, tropics have higher rates of evapotranspiration. This will lead to higher rates of species diversity. Area effects occur because larger areas tend to support more species. This leads to more habitats and microhabitats that are present in larger areas of land. This can be demonstrated by examining the bird number species on the Sunda Islands. In general, the number of bird species that are supported increases with island size. And finally, island equilibrium occurs. An island's size and distance from the mainland will also determine the number of species that are present on that island. In mangrove islands, for instance, the number of species reached an equilibrium approximately 40 days post-fumigation. The island equilibrium model was proposed by Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson in 1967. The equilibrium model has some general trends that are important to note. In general, as the number of species on an island increases, immigration rates tend to decrease. This is due to the lack of open niches that are present for invading individuals, and extinction rates tend to increase. This is primarily due to competitive exclusion. Another trend is as the size of the island increases, the number of species will also increase. This is due to higher rates of immigration and lower extinction rates. This is because in larger islands there are more habitats that are present and microhabitats. This will lead to the support of higher population sizes. And finally, as the distance from the mainland increases, the immigration rate will decrease. This is due to lack of access. In addition, the extinction rate will also typically increase. This is because species cannot be replenished as easily from mainland population sources. The island equilibrium model is depicted below. This depicts the relationship between the rate of immigration or extinction and the number of species on an island. Eventually, within an island, there will be an equilibrium reached with respect to the number of species. When this occurs, the rate of immigration equals the rate of extinction. This variable is correlated to the island's size as well as distance from the mainland. In addition to species interactions and biogeographical features, there are many other factors that can affect communities. Pathogens are known to affect biological communities. Pathogens include disease-causing microbes, viruses, viroids, as well as prions. White band disease, for example, causes bands of tissue loss in corals. After the tissue is sloughed off, these regions are then colonized by algae. This will destroy all of the infected coral and also makes the surrounding coral very vulnerable to disease as well as disturbance. Although the disease-causing agent that is responsible for this disease is not currently known, it is suspected to be bacterial in origin. When white band disease is present, it can lead to the decimation of large bands of coral reefs. The swine flu is another example. The swine flu was first detected in Veracruz, Mexico in 2009. A global outbreak then followed due to extensive human travel and for the ability for the virus to be transmitted between humans. Zoonotic diseases, like the swine flu seen previously, are diseases that can be transferred from animals to humans, either through direct contact or through an immediate species or a vector species. Common vectors include invertebrates such as ticks, lice, and mosquitoes. Many zoonotic diseases can be properly managed through extensive knowledge of the host species, the pathogen's life cycle, and identifying and controlling the modes of transmission. In New York, for example, targeted efforts were implemented to control Lyme disease. This was through the release of vaccinated white-footed mouse. However, this strategy was ineffective and didn't cause any change in the number of infected ticks that were collected during surveys. Subsequent research then identified 2 additional shrew species as vectors. This knowledge, along with proper monitoring of tick populations, has greatly improved the control efforts to control the disease. Finally, the most relevant example of how pathogens can alter community structure is by examining what we are experiencing today with the COVID-19 virus. We are currently in the midst of identifying these factors in order to implement effective control of the COVID-19 virus. Understanding how COVID-19 changes over time and understanding how it mutates will be integral in implementing effective control. Though many origins have been suspected for COVID-19, it is suspected or generally agreed that the transition from animal host to human host occurred because of mutations in the spike surface proteins. These surface proteins and the mutation would increase its ability to infect human cells. This mutation has arisen independently in other coronavirus strains isolated from bats as well as pangolins. In addition, the mutations in the surface proteins is a target for other strains and has been identified as occurring in the Brazilian as well as South African variants. Note that these occur through the natural selection process. Natural selection occurs on this virus to increase its ability to infect cells and also to spread within a population. Thus, in identifying these factors, we can better implement control measures.